The high-rise boardroom. Vivian Cole, beautiful CEO, proud and commanding, threw a safe key onto the table. She smiled with challenge. "If you can open this safe, I'll marry you." Facing her stood Mason Hale, a man in a faded shirt, eyes calm and steady. No one in the room believed he would dare try. He stepped closer, placed his hand on the safe, spoke softly. "Some things don't need keys, just trust." And when the safe opened, what left her speechless wasn't the money inside. It was her own heart. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you're watching this from. Now let's start. Mason Hale had learned to find meaning in the mechanisms of locks and security systems, the precise alignment of pins and tumblers that either granted access or maintained protection depending on whether the correct key was applied with proper technique and patience. At 33 years old, he had accepted that his engineering degree would never lead to the prestigious career he'd once imagined, that fatherhood had redirected his trajectory toward whatever work paid enough to keep Evie fed and clothed and happy in their modest apartment, where dinner conversations mattered more than the size of rooms or quality of furnishings. The maintenance position at Cole Industries headquarters provided steady income and reasonable hours that let Mason be present for Evie's school events and bedtime routines. The 8-year-old's bright personality making even the most mundane days feel purposeful. She had taken to visiting him during lunch breaks when school was out, her presence in the building becoming familiar enough that executives and assistants knew her name and saved treats for the little girl who brought such obvious joy to her father's otherwise solitary workdays. Vivian Cole commanded her inherited empire with the kind of calculated precision that came from growing up watching her father build a technology conglomerate through strategic acquisitions and ruthless efficiency, learning early that business success required emotional distance from the people whose labor made profits possible. At 30 years old, she had proven herself worthy of the CEO position through decisions that impressed the board while keeping employees at careful distance where their personal needs couldn't complicate the kind of tough choices that maintained competitive advantage. The security system failure happened during a critical board meeting when the safe containing sensitive acquisition documents malfunctioned, its electronic lock refusing to respond to any input codes, while expensive consultants struggled to diagnose the problem without success. Vivian's frustration was evident in her clipped tone and impatient gestures, the kind of controlled fury that her staff recognized as warning that someone would bear consequences for this incompetence. "A technology company that can't open its own safe," Vivian said with cutting sarcasm, her voice carrying across the boardroom where executives shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps someone can explain how we're supposed to project competence to shareholders when we can't manage basic security systems." Mason had been replacing a light fixture in the adjacent hallway when he overheard the commotion, his experience with lock mechanisms suggesting several possible solutions that the high-priced consultants apparently hadn't considered. He hesitated before entering the boardroom, acutely aware that maintenance workers didn't typically interrupt executive meetings to offer unsolicited advice. But something about the particular way the safe's mechanism was clicking suggested a problem he'd encountered before. "I might be able to help," Mason offered quietly from the doorway, his tone respectful but confident in ways that made several executives turn to assess this interruption from someone whose uniform marked him as clearly not belonging in their strategic discussions. The laughter that followed was polite but dismissive, amused by the presumption that a maintenance worker could succeed where trained specialists had failed. Vivian studied Mason with expression that combined irritation at further delays with curiosity about what gave this stranger the confidence to volunteer where others had given up. "You think you can open it?" Vivian asked, her tone carrying challenge that suggested she expected failure, but was entertained enough by his audacity to let him try. "If you manage that impossible task, I'll marry you myself." The dramatic stakes were clearly meant as joke rather than genuine offer, executives chuckling at their CEO's unexpected humor during what had been a tense and frustrating meeting. But Mason didn't laugh, his expression remaining serious as he approached the safe and examined the mechanism with the kind of careful attention that suggested genuine expertise rather than hopeful guessing. "I'll do my best," Mason replied simply, pulling a small toolkit from his maintenance belt, "though not for that particular reward. Some things matter more than marriage proposals from people I've never met." The response surprised the room into silence. Executives apparently unused to anyone declining, even joking offers from their powerful CEO. Vivian's expression shifted from amused to genuinely interested. Something about Mason's calm confidence and complete lack of deference suggesting depth she hadn't expected from someone whose job involved changing light bulbs and unclogging drains. Mason worked methodically, explaining his process as he examined the safe's locking mechanism and identified the specific failure that had defeated the consultant's more sophisticated but less intuitive approaches. "My father was a locksmith," he said while carefully manipulating the internal pins. "He used to say that every lock has its own story, its own rhythm. You can't force them open with brute strength or expensive technology. You have to listen, understand what they're trying to protect, approach them with patience rather than dominance." "You're explaining philosophy to my safe?" Vivian asked, her tone carrying genuine amusement, rather than the cutting sarcasm she displayed earlier. "Should I be concerned that my security systems require therapy?" "Not therapy," Mason corrected gently, his attention remaining focused on the delicate work even while responding to her teasing. "Just recognition that protection mechanisms exist for reasons, that they're trying to keep something safe rather than just being obstacles to overcome. Understanding that makes them willing to open when approached correctly." The metaphor wasn't lost on anyone in the room, several executives exchanging glances that suggested they recognized Vivian herself as someone whose carefully constructed defenses served similar protective functions. She stood watching Mason work with expression that cycled between skepticism and growing respect as his methodical approach began producing results where expensive consultants had failed. The safe opened with a soft click that seemed impossibly quiet for something that had resisted such determined efforts, its door swinging outward to reveal contents that made the entire room fall silent. Inside wasn't the expected acquisition documents or financial records, but instead a single photograph in a simple frame. The image showing a younger Vivian with her father in what appeared to be this very boardroom years ago, when he had still been alive and running the company she now commanded. Vivian's hand flew to her mouth, shock and something approaching pain crossing her features as she stared at the photograph she'd apparently forgotten was stored in this particular safe. The room remained silent as she reached out with trembling fingers to retrieve the frame, her carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal grief she typically kept hidden behind professional distance and strategic thinking. "Why would this be in here?" Vivian whispered, the question directed at no one in particular, as she studied the image of her father's smile and her younger self's obvious admiration for the man who had built this empire and taught her everything about business while apparently failing to teach her anything about processing loss. Mason stepped back to give her space, his expression gentle rather than triumphant, despite having succeeded where others had failed. "Maybe because you never really locked it away," he said quietly. "Some things we can't protect ourselves from just by keeping them in safes and pretending they're secured. They stay with us regardless of the mechanisms we use to try containing them. If there's a memory you've tried to bury deep, would you dare to open it again to heal yourself?" Share your thoughts below. The photograph remained on Vivian's desk for days after Mason had opened the safe, its presence creating visible disruption in her typically organized workspace and apparently in her carefully controlled emotional landscape. Staff noticed the change in their CEO's demeanor, the way her attention seemed to drift during meetings toward the image of her father, the slight softening of her usually sharp responses when dealing with employee concerns. Mason had returned to his regular maintenance duties, expecting no further interaction beyond perhaps a formal thank you or bonus payment for solving the safe problem, but instead found himself summoned to Vivian's office with increasing frequency for minor repairs that seemed designed more to facilitate conversation than address actual mechanical failures. The pretense was thin enough that both recognized it, but neither explicitly acknowledged what was really happening as they talked during these manufactured encounters. "Tell me about your father," Vivian requested during one such visit, the question emerging without preamble while Mason examined a door hinge that functioned perfectly fine. "You mentioned he was a locksmith. Did you learn the trade from him?" Mason smiled at the memory, his hands continuing their unnecessary work on the hinge, while his voice carried warmth that came from genuine love rather than idealized recollection. He taught me that locks were about trust rather than just security, he explained. That people install them not because they're paranoid, but because they need to protect things that matter. Understanding that psychology makes you better at working with security systems because you're not fighting against them, you're helping them fulfill their purpose. The philosophy resonated with something in Vivian that she couldn't quite articulate, recognition that her own protective mechanisms served similar functions to the locks and safes Mason described. She had built walls around herself after her father's sudden passing, convinced that emotional distance would protect her from experiencing that kind of devastating loss again, that controlling everything meant nothing could surprise or hurt her beyond what she permitted. My father died without warning, Vivian said quietly, the admission emerging despite years of practice at not discussing personal matters in professional contexts. Heart attack during a board meeting similar to the one where you opened the safe. One moment he was presenting quarterly results, the next he was gone, and I was suddenly responsible for an empire I didn't feel ready to manage. Mason stopped pretending to work on the hinge and turned to face her directly, his expression carrying empathy without the pity that Vivian typically rejected when people learned about her father's death. That must have been terrifying, he said simply. Losing someone you loved while simultaneously being thrust into position where everyone expected you to be strong and capable and completely unaffected by grief. The accurate assessment of her experience, delivered without judgment or attempted advice, made Vivian's eyes fill with tears she usually suppressed during work hours. I locked everything away, she admitted, gesturing toward where the photograph now sat on her desk. All the memories, the grief, the fear about whether I could actually run this company without him. I convinced myself that if I didn't feel anything, it couldn't hurt me. That if I controlled everything perfectly, nothing else could go wrong. But locks don't actually protect us from feelings, Mason observed gently. They just create the illusion that we've secured them somewhere safe. The emotions are still there regardless of how many walls we build or how carefully we manage access to our inner lives. Their conversations during these manufactured maintenance visits evolved into genuine friendship, Vivian discovering that Mason possessed the kind of emotional intelligence that her business associates typically lacked, the ability to see past her carefully constructed CEO persona to the grieving daughter who had never properly processed her father's sudden death. He shared his own experiences with loss, his wife's passing 4 years earlier, leaving him to raise Evie alone, while navigating grief that didn't respect his need to remain functional for his daughter's sake. Evie's presence in the building became more frequent as Vivian began inviting Mason to bring his daughter during their conversations, the 8-year-old's uncomplicated affection somehow making it easier for the CEO to access emotions she typically kept locked away. The little girl had taken to calling her Miss Vivi the serious lady, apparently having decided that Vivian needed someone to make her smile, and that an 8-year-old was perfectly qualified for that important role. "Why are you always working?" Evie asked during one visit, her directness typical of children who hadn't learned that some questions were considered rude or inappropriate. "Don't you have anyone to go home to?" The question hit harder than anything an adult might have asked, Vivian recognizing that her answer revealed exactly how thoroughly she'd prioritized career over personal life since her father's death. "I suppose I've been too busy building the company to think about building much else," she admitted to this perceptive child. "Work feels safer than relationships because I can control outcomes through strategy and effort." "That sounds lonely," Evie observed with devastating simplicity. "My dad says the best things in life are the ones we can't control, like love and laughter and surprise birthday parties. Maybe you need more of those things, Miss Vivi." Mason pulled his daughter close with gentle correction about not telling CEOs how to live their lives, but Vivian shook her head. "She's not wrong," Vivian said quietly. "I have been lonely. I've just been calling it focused. Thank you, Evie, for being honest about what you see." One evening as Mason prepared to leave after his shift, Vivian stopped him with a question that had been building through weeks of accumulated conversations and growing connection. "Why do you work so hard?" she asked, genuinely curious about what motivated someone who seemed content with modest circumstances, rather than ambitious for advancement and accumulation. "You're clearly intelligent and skilled enough to pursue more prestigious positions. What keeps you in maintenance work?" Mason looked toward where Evie sat doing homework in a corner chair. his expression softening in ways Vivian had learned to recognize as his response to anything involving his daughter. Because every door I unlock, every system I repair, every hour I work provides for that little girl and her future, he said simply. That purpose matters more than any title or salary I might achieve through more ambitious career choices. She's why I do everything. Vivian felt something shift in her chest, the protective walls she'd built after her father's death, developing cracks that let unfamiliar warmth seep through. Watching Mason with Evie, seeing the obvious love and devotion that defined their relationship, reminded her that life's most important work happened outside boardrooms and had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or market dominance. She had spent years measuring success by her father's standards, building the company larger and more profitable, as though those achievements could somehow honor his memory or prove she'd been worthy of the legacy he'd left her. But maybe success looked different than she'd imagined. Maybe it had more to do with the kind of love Mason showed Evie than the strategic victories that impressed shareholders, but left her returning alone to empty apartments where work was the only companion that never disappointed or left unexpectedly. If you believe that true love can come from the simplest people, subscribe to Solo Parent Stories for more stories that will make you smile. The media attention following Mason's successful safe opening was inevitable. Given Vivian's high profile and the dramatic circumstances, reporters fascinated by the narrative of maintenance workers succeeding where expensive consultants had failed and being offered marriage as reward by the notoriously cold CEO. The coverage ranged from amused to cynical, speculation about Vivian's relationship with Mason filling gossip columns and business publications alike. Rather than retreating into privacy as her advisors suggested, Vivian made an unexpected decision to leverage the attention toward something meaningful. She announced the establishment of the Keys of Hope Foundation, a program providing vocational training and business loans to single parents developing skilled trades that could support stable family lives. Mason was named as the program's inaugural recipient, his locksmith expertise finally getting formal recognition and resources to establish the security consulting business he'd dreamed about during late nights when ambition competed with exhaustion. The foundation's launch event drew significant media coverage, reporters clearly expecting standard corporate philanthropy performance art rather than the genuine emotion that characterized Vivian's presentation. She stood at the podium with Mason beside her, the contrast between her designer suit and his simple work clothes making visual statement about the program's purpose in bridging divides between economic classes. "This man taught me something I'd forgotten after my father's death," Vivian began, her voice carrying vulnerability that business reporters had never heard from the typically controlled CEO. "He showed me that not every lock opens with force or expensive technology. Some require patience, understanding, the willingness to listen rather than simply trying to dominate. That philosophy applies to security systems, but it also applies to human hearts that have learned to protect themselves through distance and control." Mason stepped forward when Vivian gestured for him to speak, his obvious discomfort with public attention making his words carry more weight than polished speeches from professional presenters. "There are people who seem like steel on the outside," he said quietly, his eyes on Vivian rather than the audience. "People who've built walls so strong that everyone assumes they're impenetrable, that they don't need or want connection. But sometimes those walls exist because someone got hurt badly enough that protection seemed like the only wise choice. Finding someone gentle enough to help them open up again, patient enough to prove that safety doesn't require isolation, that's what matters more than any lock I've ever opened." The room fell completely silent, the intimacy of Mason's words making clear that he was speaking directly to Vivian rather than delivering generic inspirational message to the assembled crowd. When spontaneous applause erupted, several people in the audience had tears in their eyes, apparently moved by witnessing genuine emotional connection rather than another corporate publicity event. Vivian's normally composed demeanor cracked as Mason spoke, her careful control giving way to tears that she didn't bother wiping away despite the cameras documenting every moment. When he finished and stepped down from the podium, she pulled him into an embrace that shocked everyone familiar with her typical professional distance, the gesture making tomorrow's headlines but in the moment, mattering only as honest expression of feelings she'd been suppressing for weeks. Evie, watching from the front row with other foundation beneficiaries' children, stood up and shouted with 8-year-old enthusiasm, "My dad made Miss Vivi cry happy tears." The observation made the entire room laugh, breaking whatever remained of formal atmosphere and transforming the event into genuine celebration rather than staged corporate messaging. The weeks following the foundation launch saw Vivian making unprecedented changes to her schedule and priorities, delegating operational responsibilities that she'd previously hoarded while creating space for activities that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or market share. She began leaving the office at reasonable hours to have dinner with Mason and Evie, discovering that conversations over home-cooked meals in their modest apartment felt more meaningful than any business negotiation or strategic planning session. Mason's apartment was small compared to Vivian's penthouse, its furniture showing wear from years of use, and its decorations consisting mainly of Evie's artwork and family photographs, rather than expensive pieces selected by interior designers. But something about the space felt alive in ways Vivian's carefully curated home never had. The evidence of genuine family life, making the modest rooms seem warmer and more welcoming than any luxury could provide. "You've been coming here a lot," Mason observed one evening after Evie had gone to bed, leaving them alone in the living room, where Vivian had become increasingly comfortable despite the contrast with her usual elegant surroundings. "People at your company must be wondering where their CEO disappears to every evening." Vivian smiled, the expression coming more easily now than it had when they'd first met. "Let them wonder. I spent years making sure everyone knew I was completely devoted to the company, that nothing else mattered beyond quarterly results and strategic positioning. Maybe it's time they learned I'm also a person who needs more than professional achievement to feel fulfilled." She moved closer to where Mason sat, her body language suggesting uncertainty about whether she was reading signals correctly or overstepping boundaries that might still exist despite all their conversations and growing connection. "You've changed my entire life," she said quietly. "Made me question everything I thought I knew about success and protection and what actually matters. I don't know if I'm brave enough to act on what I'm feeling, but I know I don't want to go back to the isolated existence I had before you opened that safe." Mason reached for her hand, the gesture gentle rather than presumptuous, despite obvious mutual feelings that had been building through accumulated time together. "I fell in love with you weeks ago," he admitted simply, "probably from the moment you cried while holding that photograph of your father, when your careful control cracked enough to show the grieving daughter underneath the powerful CEO. But I've been scared to say anything because our lives are so different, because I worried you'd think I was after your money or using you for what you could provide rather than loving you for who you are." "I love you too," Vivian whispered, the confession feeling simultaneously terrifying and liberating. "Love you and Evie both, actually. You've become the family I didn't realize I needed. The people who make me want to be more than just successful businesswoman who controls everything. I want to be someone who can be vulnerable and trust and build life that matters beyond quarterly earnings." Their first kiss happened without dramatic buildup, just two people who had been circling each other for weeks, finally acknowledging what had become obvious to everyone watching their growing connection. It was sweet and tentative and perfect, tasting of possibility and hope, and the promise that sometimes the most meaningful relationships develop from the most unexpected circumstances. Evie appeared in her bedroom doorway moments later, apparently not as asleep as they'd believed. "Are you kissing Miss Vivi?" she asked with delight. "Does this mean she's going to be my new mom?" The adults laughed despite their embarrassment at being caught, Mason pulling his daughter into embrace that included Vivian in ways that suggested the family Evie had wished for was already forming regardless of whatever formal arrangements might follow. "We're figuring things out," Mason told his daughter gently. "But yes, Miss Vivi is going to be very important in our lives." "Good," Evie declared with 8-year-old certainty. "She needs people to teach her how to have fun, and we're really good at that." The observation made Vivian laugh with genuine joy that had nothing to do with business success or strategic victories, the sound surprising her with its spontaneity and warmth. This was what she'd been missing, what all her careful control and protective distance had cost her. The chance to be part of something messy and imperfect and absolutely wonderful, a family built on love rather than strategy. The business world's reaction to Vivian's obvious relationship with Mason ranged from supportive to skeptical, some praising her for showing that successful women could build lives beyond career, while others questioned whether her judgment had been compromised by dating someone whose economic circumstances differed so dramatically from her own. The scrutiny was intense and often cruel. Gossip columns speculating about gold digger motivations and whether the CEO had lost her edge by prioritizing romance over ruthless business strategy. Vivian faced the criticism with newfound confidence that came from knowing what actually mattered. Her board meetings now starting with acknowledgement that personal relationships contributed to rather than detracted from her ability to lead effectively. "I'm better at this job because I've learned to care about something beyond quarterly earnings," she told skeptical shareholders during one particularly contentious meeting. "Having people in my life who matter more than market share has made me more effective rather than less, because I finally understand what we're building this company for beyond just accumulation of wealth." The Keys of Hope Foundation expanded rapidly under Vivian's leadership, her personal investment of time and resources making clear that this wasn't just another corporate PR initiative, but genuine commitment to helping families achieve stability through skilled trades and small business development. Mason's security consulting practice became showcase example. His transition from maintenance worker to successful entrepreneur, demonstrating exactly the kind of upward mobility the program aimed to facilitate. But success brought new challenges as Mason's business grew, and his time became increasingly divided between work demands and family needs that had always been his primary focus. Evie struggled with having less access to her father, even as their financial situation improved dramatically. The 8-year-old's occasional tears about missing him, revealing that wealth couldn't compensate for presence and attention she'd always received despite their modest circumstances. "I'm worried I'm becoming the kind of father I never wanted to be," Mason admitted to Vivian during one of their increasingly rare quiet evenings together, his voice carrying guilt about how business success was affecting his relationship with Evie. "When I was just doing maintenance work, at least my time was my own once I finished my shifts. Now I'm taking client calls during dinner and missing her school events because meetings run late. The money is better, but I'm not sure we're actually happier." Vivian recognized the painful irony that her foundation's success in helping Mason build his business had created new problems, even while solving old ones. That advancement often came with costs that weren't obvious until they'd already been paid. "What if we restructured how your company operates?" she suggested, bringing her business expertise to bear on the problem. "Built systems that give you more flexibility rather than less, hired people to handle the parts that don't require your specific expertise so you can focus on the work only you can do while maintaining time for Evie." The conversation evolved into planning session, where Vivian's strategic thinking combined with Mason's intimate knowledge of his work to create business model that prioritized his values rather than simply maximizing growth and profit. They stayed up late sketching organizational structures and discussing hiring strategies, the collaboration reminding both of them why their relationship worked despite surface differences in their backgrounds and circumstances. "You could have anyone," Mason said during pause in their planning, the observation emerging from insecurities that apparently persisted despite all evidence of Vivian's genuine affection. "Someone from your social circle who understands your world, who wouldn't require explanations about business concepts and social expectations I'm still learning to navigate. Why are you choosing this, choosing us, when it would be so much easier to date someone whose life more closely matches your own?" Vivian set down the papers they'd been reviewing and moved to sit beside him, her hand finding his with the kind of natural comfort that came from months of accumulated physical intimacy and emotional connection. "Because easy isn't the same as meaningful," she said simply. "I had easy before I met you, had wealth and success and absolute control over every aspect of my perfectly curated life. And I was miserable in ways I couldn't admit because acknowledging loneliness meant admitting that all my achievements hadn't actually made me happy." She gestured around the modest apartment that had become more home to her than her expensive penthouse ever had. "This is messy and complicated, and sometimes frustrating when our different backgrounds create misunderstandings or challenges. But it's real in ways nothing else in my life has been since my father died. You and Evie make me feel human rather than just functional. Love for who I am rather than what I can provide or accomplish. That's worth any amount of difficulty or social judgment." Mason pulled her close, his embrace communicating gratitude and relief and love that didn't require words to express clearly. They sat together in comfortable silence, the kind that developed between people who had learned each other's rhythms and didn't need constant conversation to feel connected. Outside the window, the city continued its endless activity, but inside this modest apartment, they had created space that felt separate from external pressures and expectations. Evie appeared from her bedroom where she'd supposedly been sleeping, apparently possessing the kind of radar children developed for detecting important adult conversations they wanted to influence. "Are you staying overnight again, Miss Vivi?" she asked hopefully. "Because I think you should just move in since you're here every night anyway." The suggestion made both adults laugh, despite its premature nature, though Vivian found herself seriously considering logistics that would have seemed impossible months ago when her life had been defined entirely by work and professional achievement. Moving in with Mason and Evie would require explanations to her staff and probably generate more media speculation, but those concerns felt increasingly minor compared to the appeal of waking up every morning in space that felt like genuine home rather than expensive hotel where she happened to sleep between work obligations. "We'll figure it out," Vivian promised both Mason and Evie, the words applying to immediate housing questions, but also to all the larger decisions about building their lives together in ways that honored each person's needs and values. One afternoon, Mason and Evie received an invitation to Vivian's private residence. The request framed as needing his expertise to install a new security system, but carrying undertones that suggested something more personal was happening. The address led them to an elegant home that managed to feel warm despite its obvious expense, decorated with photographs and personal touches that suggested Vivian had been learning to build spaces that felt lived in rather than just impressive. "Thank you for coming," Vivian said as she welcomed them inside, her nervousness evident despite attempts to maintain casual demeanor. "I really do need help with the security system, but there's also something else I wanted to show you." Mason completed the installation work efficiently, Evie chattering happily while exploring the house and declaring that Miss Vivi had way too many rooms for just one person. When the technical work was finished, Vivian led them to a small study where a safe sat in the corner, clearly visible rather than hidden away. "Do you want to try opening one more?" Vivian asked, her tone carrying playfulness mixed with genuine meaning. "Though I should warn you, this one is locked much more securely than the boardroom safe." Mason approached the safe and examined it carefully, recognizing high-quality equipment that would actually require skill rather than just patience to open. "This is serious security," he observed. "Are you sure you want me accessing whatever you're protecting in here?" "Very sure," Vivian confirmed, moving closer. "Though maybe this one doesn't need your locksmith skills after all." She reached out and took his hand, placing it on the safe's handle. "It's not locked," she said softly. "I've been leaving it open, waiting for the right person to look inside." Mason opened the safe door to find it nearly empty, except for a small velvet box and a handwritten note. He picked up the note, reading words that made his breath catch. "For the man who taught me that the strongest protection isn't about locks, but about trusting someone enough to let them in." Inside the box was a simple key on a delicate chain, clearly meant to be worn rather than used for any practical purpose. "What does this open?" Mason asked, though something in Vivian's expression suggested he already knew the answer. "Nothing mechanical," Vivian replied, her voice trembling slightly. "It's symbolic. You opened my heart when I thought it was locked away forever. This is me giving you the key officially, asking if you want to keep it." Evie, who had been watching with barely contained excitement, suddenly shouted, "Dad, she's asking if you want to be with her forever. That's what keys mean." Mason laughed, pulling both Vivian and Evie into an embrace. "I've wanted to keep it since the day we met," he said honestly. "Since you challenged me to open that safe, and I realized that what needed opening wasn't the metal box, but your willingness to trust again." "Does this mean Miss Vivi is going to live with us?" Evie asked hopefully. "Because I already told everyone at school she's going to be my new mom." Vivian knelt down to Evie's level, tears streaming down her face but smiled bright with genuine joy. "If that's okay with you and your dad, then yes. I want to be part of your family, not just someone who visits sometimes." The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the three of them together in this space that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The safe stood open behind them, No longer needed because Vivian had learned that true security came not from locks, but from letting the right people close enough to matter. Mason looked at the key in his hand, then at Vivian's hopeful face, then at Evie's delighted expression. "I don't need a key," he said softly. "Your heart's already open. But I'll keep this as a reminder that the bravest thing anyone can do is trust someone else with what they're protecting most carefully." They stood together surrounded by evidence of Vivian's wealth and success. But what mattered wasn't the expensive furnishings or impressive architecture. What mattered was that three people had found each other despite all the reasons why their connection seemed improbable. Building family from courage and vulnerability and genuine love that didn't require perfect circumstances to flourish. If you believe that some doors only open with sincerity, subscribe to Solo Parent Stories for more stories that will warm your heart again.